4 of the interview, and we have a very, very, very special guest today. We have Lindi Ngwenya, who is the founder and managing director of Sisu Sports, but she's not just somebody who runs a sports agency. She's also someone who is a role model for a lot of people. She has played competitive rugby for 15 years, and she has also served as a British Army officer. But I will not tell you what Lindi is famous for. I want Lindi to tell you what she is famous for. So Lindi, I want to tell our audience why you are a role model and you're considered to be a role model across the world, especially in football.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I think, to be honest, I'll be a little bit more bashful about that. I mean, all I've always tried to do through my whole career is to really kind of open out the opportunities for, in particular, the athletes that I work with. I started Sisu Sports Management in 2013. And from the inception, it's always been about giving a platform to underserved football talents. And for me, that's largely remained unchanged. It's been women's football, which has continued to grow, particularly in the last 2-3 years. Fantastic growth rate. African football, with the amount of talent just across the continent there, whether it be West, East or South Africa, and even Northern Europe, which is a market, or the markets of Scandinavia in particular, have been a really fertile kind of staging post for a lot of the female talent and the African talent that we've worked with. So for me, it was always from the outset about providing opportunities and pathways for players. And I think maybe being a woman in the industry and a Black woman in the industry, where there's not so many, it's really kind of male-dominated industry. I think as my sort of success or my achievements have grown, then certainly I have felt and noticed that there has been a real element where people have been inspired by some of the work that the agency has been doing, which is good. This is a really good feeling. But I'd be kind of being a little bit dishonest if I said from the outset that's what I wanted to achieve.
Right. So Lindy, your 2 main points of women's football as well as African football, right? So they both have been doing fairly well and have shown some very tangible progress in the past few years. So has that progress been as per your research and expectation, or how much more do you think should be done to get it to an even higher level? Because as we saw during the AFCON, there were a lot of comments, why do players need to go to the AFCON, right? Similar comments are not made about the Euros, for example. So
yes, I think, there's always been, I think, an issue with African football, if we start on that side, being able to kind of get the respect it should do in the wider football community. Because let's be honest, the sort of the most dominant competitions out there are quite Eurocentric. You've got the Champions League, you've got the World Cup, but actually if you look at the participation by confederation, by far the biggest participants are UEFA. So, there's always going to be a big Eurocentric at the moment kind of lens on a lot of the major competitions. But I do think that, there has been traditionally a lot of concern from European clubs who employ particularly African players about the fact that they have to release the players every 2 years. And I think it really came to a head, and it was a good time for it to come to a head on this round of AFCON, when I think even over in Africa, I think a line a little bit was drawn in the sand when, there was big pushback around, the complaints of clubs, etc., to releasing players. Because like you say, African football has a storied history across all the different parts of the continent. And the AFCON tournament itself is a major tournament. So I feel going forward that the line has been drawn. I think, the message was heard clearly over here in Europe, particularly from some of the journalists and the media who have been, some of the worst kind of offenders in, I would say kind of trivializing African football. I think going forward that there will be a better tone on that side. We go into women's football. That's where I've probably got the most concerns. I mean, there's no doubt that we're seeing a lot of talent coming through from the African continent, from the women's side. There's no doubt that the introduction of the women's Champions League tournament is a really big step forward. And even off the back of that, I've been able to progress some players' careers after their performance in that tournament. But again, there's a lot of lip service being paid if you look across the continent to developing the women's game. And, the picture around sort of established national leagues, around even like youth tournaments is very, very patchy across the continent when you actually look at it and drill down to it. And without having those structures in place, it's hard to really consistently be able to produce the right sort of players, and also give those players a platform from which they can develop and go on to bigger and better things. So I really want to see a more kind of integrated, a more concerted effort to develop the women's game, rather than, kind of having sort of flashes of attention around things like women's AFCON and the Champions League.
So you were recently involved in launching the Emerging Stars football club in Nairobi, Kenya, right? But I've also heard that you are, talking to a lot of Indian footballers as well. So what we would want to know from you in terms of Indian football, what's your involvement? What are the kind of emerging stars you are seeing? Of course, we are headquartered out of India, so that's something of a special interest for us.
So I have been talking to a number of kind of parties over in India, a couple of big agencies, a couple of individuals who kind of are active in the Indian market, really to try to get a handle of what the talent pool is, and not just the existing talent pool, to understand what the structures are. Because at the end of the day, it's having the structures in place and the right pathway will determine whether or not you're going to see kind of long-term and consistent production of, good quality players. Now, some of the players who, there's some senior players like Bala Devi is probably the most well-known Indian female player. She was obviously at Rangers up here in Scotland until not too long ago. So she's a player who broke through, it seemed, just purely from her talent and, kind of manifesting that. But I think we want to see kind of the next Bala Devi. Where did she come from? How was she developed? And really, those are the conversations I'm having, is to try and understand maybe which of the academies that might be kind of developing the players, what the methodologies are, and then picking up and keeping tabs on the talent that's coming through. So for us, it's really important to find the right country partner with the knowledge, with the right kind of ethical framework to work with the players and the talent. And once we're confident that we have that in place, then absolutely, we're definitely looking at kind of starting to work with the emerging talent in India.
So Lindi, you talked about some people paying lip service to the women's football game and just flashes of attention instead of a concerted effort to improve at the grassroots level. So which clubs do you think do women's football the best?
Yeah, I think, if we take the example of the UK, I like to include Scotland as well in this. I think, if you look at the way Rangers and Celtic in the last few years have really decided to, make their women kind of a fully professional setup. And you can be professional in name, but what that really means is around, the support systems and the structures you have for the players, the facilities that they train in. I think both of those clubs are taking really good strides forward in developing the women's game and therefore making the Scottish League more competitive. Again, we've touched on, and then there's other teams I think that maybe don't have as big a budget, but I think are definitely deserve a mention because they've structured things very well. I think most recently, we look at Leicester. They're actually one of the few women's teams out there that have their own training facility. So we're talking about, I know it's great to hear teams like Arsenal, for instance, training in the main training centre alongside the men. And that is a big statement in itself. And it's very, very positive. But the advantage a team like Leicester have with their own training centre for all their women's teams from the age groups up to the senior is that the focus is 100% on the women's team. There's no compromises around schedule clashing. There doesn't need to be any kind of workarounds with fitting the different teams together. Everything's about maximising the performance of the women's team and ultimately the first team. So they've made great strides and they've got a really great structure there over in Leicester. I think should be commended. When I look at Africa, let's use the Women's Champions League as a good example. You had from South Africa, you had Mamelodi Sundowns. Now that is a team that probably I would say for the women's side is the best organised, the best supported women's team on the continent. But even then, you've got players who are earning salaries that are a fraction of what the men would earn in the same club, and aren't really in terms of the sum of the salary what you would call a full-time salary. Although clearly there's a lot of support, the coach and the technical staff, etc., are very, very strong. So that's kind of like the strongest team in the continent.
Okay, so Lindy, what do you think in recent years has made Africa such a talent pool for the European market, where they just come by players on the penny and then make them superstars?
I think ever more increasingly in the last sort of 10, 30 years, as more money's gone into football, I think people have realized that it can be a pathway out of poverty and to a better life. So consequently, you're seeing a lot of boys and increasingly girls playing the game from a young age, playing, many hours of football, whatever it be in kind of, school playgrounds, fields, etc. And that accumulation of hours of, football play, if you've got a talented player, plus you actually add in the actual, the quantum of hours of training and playing, then you are going to produce talent. And I think that's what we've seen in Africa for a number of years. I think that the positive developments is around that, in the past, the cliche with African players is that technically they're fantastic. Again, all those years playing in the parks with their friends, the technical base is there, the physical base is there. The cliche was that the tactical kind of base isn't there. But actually the coaching is definitely improving across the board. I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Nigeria where I watched the pre-season tournament. It was on the men's side, but it was like pre-season for the NLO, which is the third tier of Nigerian football. And what I really noticed from my previous visit to Nigeria 4 years previous was the standard of coaching had really gone up a level. There was much more kind of knowledge and emphasis on tactical shape. That you could see that was being relayed to the players.
What I wanted to ask you is, how is being an agent, because you handle both the roles, how is being an agent for men's football completely different from women's football, or it's not? I just want to understand that from you.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, men and women, we're all humans. So there's certain commonalities around, being an agent for men's football and women's football there. Just the commonalities around treating players and coaches with respect, really kind of understanding players' needs and really looking as an agent to address them so that they can perform at the highest level. As you get further into careers, things like wealth management are also services that you have to provide. Tax advice, all of this stuff none of it is particularly glamorous, but this is all common to the men and the women's game. The main difference I would say with the men's game to the women's game is that because it's a much more mature market, men's football, has been with us much longer in the professional sense, the opportunity set is so much bigger. And because the opportunity set is so much bigger, then you have to be much more focused in the players you choose to work with and also the markets that you operate in. Otherwise, the danger is that you kind of cover all bases, but don't really actually make any traction. Because for the same token, it's also very competitive to get players into clubs. Any club, if you talk to, they'll probably say that they get like tons and tons of emails and phone calls every single day from different agencies. So it's important to be focused in the men's game and really understand what your offering is and what you can give for the clubs. For the women's side, it's still at the point now where the talent pool is not so large. So if you have a talented player, you can normally get good traction on that player in a number of key markets relatively quickly. So it's still relatively clear that way. And then I guess the third area I'd say with a lot of the female players that I work with, that sometimes kind of self-confidence is an area where you really have to keep kind of bolstering the player's self-confidence. I don't know whether it's something we inherently as females, I think we are a little bit less, how can I say, cocksure than some of the lads. Because if anything with the lads, a lot of the time, sometimes you have to almost try to talk them down a little bit because they're maybe not quite as good or they're not quite as progressed as they think they are. Whereas girls, you have to almost always keep encouraging them, try to keep the confidence levels high. And yeah, that's definitely about kind of the way you talk to the players and the way you treat them.
For our audience, how would you describe like social mobility, like the phenomenon of social mobility? Because that's essentially what you're doing. That's what you're helping them do.
I mean, I even talk, if I look at my own situation, I was born and brought up in the UK, in London, but my parents, my parents moved from Zimbabwe to the UK. Clearly that was a move that they did in order to, I guess, from their perspective, get a better life for themselves and their children. And I think, if we look kind of retrospectively at that, that's a move that did help to achieve that. I think that's really the same thing I'm trying to help players with who are talented, is to give them routes where they can make a living for their talent. And I'll be honest with you, it's a bit of a kind of a double-edged sword, because on one side, I'm sad in a way that, say, for instance, African players, that for them to get on in their careers, it's still very much the route that they have to move to Europe. I'd love a situation where actually, players could stay in Africa and have a really, really productive and, rewarding career. And ultimately, if we achieve that, I think that's where we really want to be on the social mobility. What it means is really social mobility is finding opportunities for players where they can earn a living, where they can better their lives for themselves and also potentially for their immediate and even their extended family.
How do you pick and choose which clients you have to support, which can be good in the long term, and how do you balance it with being a vehicle for social mobility?
Yeah. So I think, the name Sisu is a Finnish word, and it means basically sort of resilience in the face of adversity. And, I've always thought, and I strongly believe, and time, I think, has borne it out as well for the agency, that the biggest determinant for the success of a particular athlete's career is around the character piece, is around the moral piece, what resilience they have, what strength of character they have. And that's really kind of almost like the first thing that we look for in players when we decide on, what sort of players you want to work with, what their character is telling us about them. Now, clearly it is a talent sport, so we do have certain parameters we look at in terms of play. So, football is getting more and more athletic. And so, to be brutally honest, players who have that sort of athletic ability and they can combine that with the technical aspects, the skill aspects of the game, are always players that are of interest to us. And then really kind of the last piece is around, the willingness to learn. And you do always find that, again, as a player goes through their sort of youth career and they've got various coaches who kind of are instrumental in kind of developing their game, there tends to be this sort of crossover. And I will say it's around about the sort of late teens, early 20s, as someone matures from kind of childhood to adulthood. Now, in some cases, I've found that some players almost like feel that once they become an adult, there's not really anything more for them to learn. They've kind of hardwired all their characteristics and everything into their game. And again, those are the sort of players who don't really progress beyond maybe having a very, very storied or decorated early career, but they don't really progress in their game. So, players who have that sort of hunger to keep developing, to keep improving, to keep listening and to keep learning, those are all the sort of players that we try to work with.
Give us that most quirkiest incident that you ever had while, trying to be an agent for the player, trying to sign up that player for a club, whatever has been as an agent, what has been the most quirkiest incident and what has been the most hilarious incident for you as an agent?
Yeah, to be honest, I have to kind of self-censor some of it because some of the funnier moments are really, kind of comical, if you know what I mean. Again, so I'll be very, very discreet. One of the funniest, I think, moments for me was effectively scouting a player. I'm not even going to say the country, scouting a player in the country, with all the footage and everything, getting that player a trial into a club in a Northern European country. And basically, when the player turned up to the club, it was a different player to the one that we'd actually scouted and put forward. So yeah, that was a little bit tricky, a little bit difficult as well to kind of explain that one away. Long and short of it, we did go back and we did manage to fish the correct player. It was a genuine misunderstanding. Well, I'd like to think it was. And yeah, that was probably one of the funnier incidences. And then I think, there's always, kind of comic moments that you have with clubs and with players in particular. Players go into clubs, and like I said, they're all human beings, and a lot of them are actually young human beings, right? So all the same things that you have with young, college students and people like that, groups of young people, you always kind of have similar things like that with players. So sometimes those phone calls in the morning, on a Monday after things have happened over the weekend, and you've got to smooth things over, fix things, etc. Yeah, that's kind of quite common as well in my line of work. Sorry to be vague, but I really don't want to incriminate or put anyone in the frame.
So where do you see Sisu in the next 5 years in terms of your growth on the pitch with regards to athletes and players, and off the pitch in regards to your efforts to uplift some of the lesser privileged sections of the society?
Yeah, really good question. So you're already actually seeing the beginnings of like the next phase for Sisu. If you look out there, we've just launched Sisu Africa, which is a specific subsidiary of Sisu, starting it in Nigeria, in Lagos. And that's our kind of, that's kind of us really kind of walking the walk in terms of having the presence in the region and really going to build out from there across that region and across the continent of Africa. That's really going to be the focus over the next couple of years, and then is looking at even expanding into other territories. And we've already again had that conversation with regards to India, and for us, as I said earlier, it's a very interesting territory for us. Just in general, actually, the AFC territory is the area that we're looking at more broadly. And the next step will be kind of establishing, like you say, a bridgehead, a flagship there, and also in the Americas. So yeah, how are we looking 5 years' time? If the growth plans are as we expect and as we're planning, then we're looking at kind of Sisu being established across all the major markets globally.
So you talked about if everything goes to plan, like last 3 years, due to COVID-19, nothing has gone to plan. So what was the effect of that on your business and your profession specifically?
Yeah, yes. I think everyone in the industry had to adapt to the pandemic and the kind of the challenges that it threw up. I mean, in particular for a business like ours, where, like I said, we work in a lot of underserved areas, a big issue was around the border closures, because a lot of the Schengen area was closed, for instance. So the flow that you have naturally of a lot of players from non-European countries into some of those European countries really kind of significantly choked off. So that has seen a depression of some of the player flow over that sort of pandemic period. But thankfully, as we come out that pandemic period, I think we'll see kind of an increase in activity, even an overshoot the other way from that suppressed demand that we've had over the last 2-3 years. So we've had to navigate that a little bit. That kind of made us have to focus a little bit more on our sort of core European market. That was one benefit in the sense that, we have grown a lot of our presence domestically in the UK and England. We brought on the director of women's football, who's based in London in the UK. And her role essentially is really to continue to grow our domestic market here in the UK. So it did make us have to focus maybe on our more sort of markets closer to home. I think one advantage of the pandemic is there's been a much faster shift to, digital tools for evaluation and analysis. So actually that's kind of helped to streamline some of the process around, player placement and player recruitment. In the old days, you'd have, some clubs who really wouldn't kind of look at video footage or didn't really take much notice of, analysis reports. Well, all of that's really changed. A lot more clubs are up to speed with that, which means that if you're also tapped in to that area, the conversations kind of flow a lot more quickly. You can kind of discount or include or progress conversations a lot more quickly. It's made the workflow, I think, a lot more efficient, particularly around the player placement and recruitment side.
How difficult do you find, because I asked it about your players, but how difficult as an agent you find in an industry which is dominated by men?
I think the biggest thing to always have is just to come from at least the base of having a reasonable amount of knowledge. I think once you can show competence, competence always breeds confidence, I would say. And that's always what I try to do. You know, even when I sort of first, before I even stepped into, you know, the role as an agent, I did do a couple of courses to understand better about the business. I think when I started the business back in 2013, we still had the agent exam. And whilst that was scrapped, although it's probably going to make a comeback now with the new FIFA regulations coming in later this year. But, you know, at the time when I tried to go into the industry, you had to do an exam, and the exam was very difficult. So because it was very difficult, you had to do a lot of work around the laws of the game and other bits and pieces. And that gave a really, really good grounding into kind of not the sort of day-to-day of being an agent, because the day-to-day of being an agent and signing players and working with people is about relationship management. It's a lot of it is about soft kind of skills that you need to develop. But the knowledge and having that about the markets and being able to at least have credible conversations with players and clubs, I think makes a big difference. And that was what helped me initially from the outset. You know, over the years, I've not actually come across too many what could be termed male chauvinists. I think you do always have to kind of jump that sort of credibility barrier when you first kind of meet or talk with a club, etc., because they'll look at you and they'll probably wonder a little bit kind of what your background is and why are you in front of them talking about players, particularly in my case, because I've never played the game. So, you know, again, I'm not coming from the perspective of an ex-player who can talk from that angle. So I've always really tried to just use the accumulation of knowledge, always being open-minded, always trying to learn new things and stay kind of on top of developments in the industry as an entry into being submitted or being admitted to some of these kind of, you know, clubs and being accepted for what I can do and bring.
What are your thoughts on the, as you said, FIFA's new regulations, agents exam coming back, capping the commission on agents fees? What are your thoughts on that particular?
Yeah, I mean, a very hot topic at the moment. You know, I think there's some things that I think are just clear common sense, and I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with. You know, I think one of the worst things they did was scrapping the licensing system a few years back and removing that exam requirement. And I already touched on some of the benefits of that, you know. So I'm very happy that they're looking at kind of reintroducing an exam system. And also, as well as that, having a continuing professional development framework. So I think every year you'll have to refresh your knowledge and obviously demonstrate in some sort of way, whether it be through a written exam or some other means that you have refreshed your knowledge. That is hugely important for the industry because there's far too many people involved who don't really know what they're doing, quite frankly. I think they've just sort of, you know, they see from the outside what they think is a lucrative industry. They watch a bit of TV, you know, they watch a bit of football on TV and they think suddenly they can become an agent. There are too many people like that in the industry and they need to be kind of swept away. That's positive. I think when you start going into the area of capping agents' commissions, this is where I think, you know, FIFA is going into the territory of overreach. I don't think it's in FIFA's gift to be setting tariffs and rates, you know, really off the back of, you know, commercial transactions. You know, the rate of an agent's paid is something that should be determined between the player and the agent, or if you're working for a club, between the club and the agent. You know, and I can't think of any other analogy in any other industry where such a cap would kind of go through the courts. So for me, I think it's, you know, there's a continuing argument at the moment around what is FIFA as an entity. You know, it seems that FIFA is trying to kind of ring fence more and more stakeholders in the game and effectively take complete control of the global game and have itself as a separate institution outside of government bodies, outside of judicial bodies. I don't think that's something that's viable in the long term.
Before I close this, I have a couple of questions. So this is a rapid fire, Lindi. The top 2 talents coming out of Sisu in 2022. Okay, let's make it top 5.
Top 5, wow. Listen, I've got, I just touched on the fact that I just come back from a pre-season tournament in Nigeria. And off the back of that tournament, I've got 3 really, really exciting talents, young Nigerian players, a striker coming out of a kind of a tier 3 team called Olinsile. We've also got a midfielder and we also got a goalkeeper. And like I said, I think I will reveal further details about those in due course, but definitely watch this space. We're looking at basically those players entering the Scandinavian as well as a couple of markets in Eastern Europe over the summer period. So those are very, very exciting for us. On the women's side, I've really started to kind of, as we said, with the launch of CSU Africa, look to increase our kind of player management, particularly of some of the players in the sort of West African and Southern African markets we have. We've got a fantastic player in South Africa who did actually have some participation in the Champions League tournament with Sundowns and Lalona. And we're definitely looking, I think, next summer for her really to break through into the general football world. I think the next Champions League tournament is the platform for her to shine, and then subsequent to that, to make a big move into one of the European clubs. And then one of the players who's not really, I wouldn't say she's under the radar because she's already a national team player, Stella Semenova, Slovakian player, fantastic attitude, really great kind of attributes character-wise as well as playing-wise. She's moved out of Slovakia into a club in Cyprus, and I really think she's a player who's ready now for, you know, a team in one of the big European leagues. So again, keep an eye out for Stella and the summer moves that we have for her.
And you're talking about a European club a lot in the last 2 minutes. So top 5 European clubs that your talent is going to in the summer.
I think we keep an eye on France. I think we have a close eye on Italy. I think those are the leagues that I'm really focusing on for now.
It was a pleasure interviewing you, Lindi, and you have already promised us on this interview that the next talent that goes to a big club from Sisu, we are going to get the interview first. On that note, it was just a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for what you're doing and breaking the ceiling that is the world of agents in the world of football. Lindi Ngwenya, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Great to talk to you guys and look forward to having more great conversations in future.